Hi everyone, and welcome to today's chat. My name is Trinia. I'm a team member here at Understood. And today we're going to be talking about how to help your child with communication skills. And we're super happy to have Jules Csillag here with us. Jules is a speech-language pathologist and is going to be answering some of your questions today. Jules, thanks for joining us. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Do you want to take just a minute to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Absolutely. So as you said, I'm a speech-language pathologist, so that means that my training is in how children learn language and develop language, and then if something doesn't go according to plan, we kind of step in. And speech pathologists can work in a lot of different settings, but my work has predominantly been in schools with a range of students across ages and across language abilities. So I'm excited to be here.
Great. Thanks so much. And for our viewers out there, I just want to remind you, if you're joining us for the first time, we do take your questions during this chat. So if you have a question for Jules, go ahead and type it in the chat box or in the comments on YouTube, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. But to get us started, I do have some questions as we're waiting for parent questions to come in. So Jules, maybe you can start by talking about what are some of the reasons that kids might struggle with communication or language skills?
Okay. Starting with kind of a big one because there's sort of developing research on that. But no, it's a great question. My shortest answer is brain. So all language is housed in various parts of the brain. And so when children develop language, something might be different in their just neurological development, so how their brains develop. But there can also be other things that are not strictly linguistic that impact it. So hearing differences or difficulties, right? If a child is deaf, their language will develop differently. If the child has lots of ear infections, their language may develop differently. If a child has like mobility differences, if they're not able to walk independently, that might impact how they talk, because the way most children develop language is by exploring their environment. So someone could have a language difference, even if it's not sort of a strictly language issue. But for children who have intact sight and hearing and motor development, it is just, there are a couple of brain scans now being done on like sort of their brains might be different. There's a lot more on dyslexia specifically, but even other types of language disorders, which I'm sure we'll get into later, are at the core of it, neurological differences. And there's also, like, I guess, a genetic component. So there are often siblings or twins, especially, or families tend to have, if you're biologically related, families tend to have overlap. So that's sort of my kind of broad answer. But what we do know, it has nothing to do with like bad parenting or poor environment or any of that. It is none of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, is just acknowledging that genetics play a big role in this, and that there are brain differences that some kids, some people might have that affects their language or communication skills. Maybe we can dive into thinking a little bit about how can parents know if maybe their kid is just a little bit behind on communication skills and they're going to catch up, or if there is something more serious going on that they should have checked out.
Well, that's a good question. There are, I guess, a couple of different answers. Sometimes things like siblings or similarly related neighbors and cousins can help if you sort of see a difference, but then there's various things around like maybe birth order and whatnot. Essentially, if your child is in some sort of school setting, whether it's preschool or kindergarten or daycare, they're hopefully often that the caregivers there or the preschool teachers or whoever can sort of assess children in comparison to their peers. But it also helps to know just how like typically developing students develop. So all kids, for example, this is just like a phonological example, will say like wabbit before they say rabbit for a while. And, it can go back and forth on whether it's between 5 and 7 years old when kids develop that. But that is part of typical development. It's also part of typical development that kids at one point will say runned instead of ran. So I think talking to teachers or speech therapists just to know, well, what is typical? Like lots of kids go through making these quote unquote mistakes, which tend to be cute for a while. And then often it's around, again, often between 5 and 7, depending on which specific skill we're talking about, that kids by 7 or 8 have all their sounds mastered. Kids by around 5 and 6 have all of those mistakes like runned kind of out of their language. They're not overgeneralizing plurals or all those things. So you can kind of tell pretty young, but again, some of those things can be impacted by things like environment or other languages or things like that. So I guess my shortest answer is defer to their peers or whoever is in a educational setting. And also there's lots of things that you can, Understood has this too. If you look up language milestones show you kind of around the ages when you're exposed to see something. And it also I guess, shows you what is still ahead of your kids. If you're looking at a 3-year-old's milestones, you'll see, oh, some of these things are still not there because we don't expect that to develop until they're about 5. So knowing the typical mistakes most kids make, at least in, for example, those are English examples, can help.
Yeah, I think that's really important, looking at those milestones. You can look those up online, or you can talk to your child's teacher or doctor to find out what some of those typical milestones are for kids. And always acknowledging that there is a lot of variety in when these kids develop, when different kids develop these skills, and that not everybody develops them at the same time.
Yeah.
But Jules, can you talk a little bit more about what parents should do if it does seem like their kid is behind significantly from their peers? What is the next step?
Absolutely. I think depending on if it's the caregivers who notice it first or at the school setting, I do think ultimately if having a speech-language pathologist involved is helpful, and especially in the United States, there, without getting too much into the legal jargon of it, all individuals who qualify for services, for speech and language services, are entitled to free services from a speech-language pathologist. So none of this is intended to cost money. And again, this idea of like being entitled to that, it means that, right, children who qualify can get that. But even before going through any of those stages of getting to a speech language pathologist, a big thing that helps is creating sort of like language rich environments. So things like talking with kids and in authentic settings, or books can help, but basically like spending time, and it doesn't have to be caregivers, whoever it is, creating environments where there is a lot of language being used can often support language development. Again, that's for like a lot of different types of language differences or delays, and sometimes that is enough to catch kids up.
Sure. So I'm hearing two things, in that parents might want to seek out an evaluation and maybe getting services from a speech language pathologist, but also that there's things that we can do at home with our kids. And of course, they might need additional services, but parents are always asking, what can I do to help my kid develop these skills that they might be struggling with? So I'm wondering, can you give us some examples of what does create this like rich literacy environment at home, or what are some activities parents can do with their kids?
Yeah, I think some of the trickiness there is that if a child is typically developing, they actually need they can get by with sort of pretty little, like because humans are wired to learn language. If a child is typically developing, there are certain cultures in the world or family cultures where there isn't a lot of like conversation among adults and children. And so there's nothing wrong with, depending on how you're raising children, if you talk to them a lot or not talk to them a lot, that is usually enough because our brains are wired for language. However, if a child's brain is not as wired for language, they do need a little bit of additional support. And again, they're all intended to be free and sort of authentic. I guess that's the biggest thing I want to stress, is to do language in authentic environments, and nothing like flashcards and drilling and those kinds of things at home don't really make a lot of sense for most families, and they don't really mirror how language develops typically. And so following kids' leads can help, or like a big thing I'm into is like kids' interests, right? There is a lot of increasing research about if kids are involved in their interests, right? Lots of kids like, let's say, dinosaurs. That ends up helping their language development, that ends up helping their reading and writing. So sort of seeing what your kids are into and doing that in naturalistic environments. If kids like the park, great, go to the park and, I don't know, comment on what they're doing, learn about the different types of trees. All of those things can, transfer over to other types of language. And again, the main thing I want to focus on is that they're sort of authentic and naturalistic, which both I believe that caregivers shouldn't be the same as therapists, but also that is just how language develops. So anything that, and same thing with, literacy. If your child does have access to books, that's great. Again, libraries are, of course, a great place to get books, but there too, I wouldn't necessarily like drill what the letters are. You can just like look at the pictures, and that too just familiarizes kids with books and some literacy knowledge, without actually like worrying about the exact letters when kids are still pre-reading.
Absolutely. So it sounds like finding situations that your kids are already interested in, like you said, if they're interested in dinosaurs or whatever it is, following their lead and having conversations with them, or looking at information. If you're working on reading skills as well, you can read books about that, or really just tying it to their interests and like in a fun environment.
Yeah, and there's also a sort of strategy called recasting, which is basically if a child does say something with an error, which again might be part of typical development or might be part of a language difference, having parents repeat it or caregivers repeat it in a way that is sort of grammatically correct is helpful. That doesn't mean you have to make them re-say it or specifically correct them, but if someone says, like, the child says dog go, then a caregiver would say, like, yes, the dog is going to the park or something. So, like, kind of expanding on it, but also saying it more sort of correctly helps. So again, that makes it more naturalistic, but also gives your kids a model. And again, like, that sort of might not be as natural or authentic sounding, but sort of trying to, again, recast what it's called, to re-say what the kid is saying and potentially expanding on it. Dog go, yes, the dog is going, and then adding on to the park or whatever it is. But again, without necessarily making the kid repeat it, but it's just good to have those language models.
Oh, I think that's a really great suggestion, to repeat what the kid is saying with the correct grammar or the correct words, not reprimanding them or telling them, oh, you did this wrong and it needs to be this way, and having them redo it, but just kind of in the natural flow of conversation, repeating what they said in the correct way. That's really helpful. Jules, I have another question. And this is, one of our parents is asking more specifically about speech-language pathology and what speech-language pathologists can really help kids with. And I also want to remind anyone who's out there watching, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the comments box. But Jules, can you talk a little bit more about what you do as a speech-language pathologist and how you help kids with their communication?
Yes, that's a very common question, because we have, thankfully or not, a really broad scope of practice, meaning that some speech pathologists work with children as soon as birth, and some speech pathologists work with adults up to 100. But I would say at the preschool and school level, speech pathologists work on students who don't communicate with words or communicate with fewer words than their peers might. So again, non-speaking or minimally verbal students. Speech pathologists can work on reading and writing, which I think we might get into a little bit later, as far as like organization of language. So oftentimes if a child has difficulty expressing themselves verbally through speaking, they might then also have difficulties with writing. Or same, if a child has trouble understanding something, they might have trouble with reading, right? Those are really closely connected skills. So in that sense, speech pathologists might work on reading and writing and language. There's also various other skills that speech pathologists can work on. If a child has a dysfluency or a stutter, speech pathologists work with autistic individuals and families similarly on communication. Some speech pathologists use technology. I happen to really like technology, both for addressing reading and writing, or for students who are minimally verbal, or sometimes speech pathologists work on sound differences. So if it's hard to understand a child, speech pathologists can address that, and sometimes technology can help with that as well, as like a support. Or if it's hard to understand someone communicating through their mouth, then they might use a assistive technology or some sort of device to communicate. So there's kind of like a broad number of things that we can work on, but ultimately I would say the main thing that it's in common is language and communication at a developmentally appropriate level.
Absolutely. And is this something that parents would receive through the school, that they would have had an evaluation done at school and gotten these services written into an individual education plan, or what does that system look like for getting the services?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So not every school has an on-site speech-language pathologist, but as I said, like, the law does provide for, if there is an evaluation and a child is deemed to have communication differences, then it depends on if it's the federal government or the state government, depending on where the speech pathologist actually works. But aside from the nitty-gritty of that, even before that happens, there are things that, again, we listed some family things, or that teachers can do, or some speech pathologists, sometimes evaluations can take a long time. So depending on your school setting, sometimes speech pathologists can work on, like, sort of at-risk, I guess, is some services. And therefore, again, sometimes some children, again, if maybe they just moved, and so there might be some, like, emotional differences, or maybe for some kids, reading is a little bit slower to develop, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're dyslexic or qualify for sort of a diagnosis. So even before you have a formal diagnosis that then does entitle a child to an individualized education plan or IEP, and then getting speech services, whether it's in the class or in a group or what have you, which again then protects the child and holds the school accountable for those goals. Sometimes kids can meet with a special educator or with a speech language pathologist to see if there's some sort of short-term gains to be made without necessarily a formal diagnosis. That is really school dependent, but many schools are going that way because it can take a while to qualify for services and get an IEP going.
Mm-hmm. And I have a question. That I was a high school special education teacher before working here at Understood. And I worked with a lot of students who had a diagnosis, or they had been identified as having dyslexia or learning disability in reading. And in getting to know those kids and looking through their files, I came to find out that a lot of them, when they were younger in elementary school, had a language disability and they needed services from a speech-language pathologist. Can you talk about what is the relationship between reading disabilities and language disabilities? And is that common for kids to initially need speech-language assistance and services, and then later on they're struggling more with reading?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an accurate observation, and I was like, I have research to support it, but you have your lived experience to share exactly that. So it is about half and half. So I would say about current, like the research right now fluctuates around about 50% of individuals with language differences or disabilities also have dyslexia, and sort of vice versa. And there's also there's dyslexia is pretty heterogeneous. So there's also like one line of thinking or research that talks about dyslexia as developmental language difference. So in which case then all kids with dyslexia would have a language difference, because dyslexia is so related to language. But I guess I kind of want to like highlight this sort of chart thing that I'm trying to show. So some students with dyslexia have sort of strictly phonological, so something based in their sound system. So if I see a B, I don't know that it says B. Whereas one type of dyslexia also has to do with comprehension. So maybe, so whether or not you're able to see that the B says the, then what does that mean in the word ball or whatever? And so because there's two types of sort of dyslexia, those types of dyslexia that are strictly phonological, again, speech language pathologists do work on phonology, and sometimes there's mixed research now on like kids who have trouble developing their sounds are sometimes more likely to develop dyslexia, because again, then there's this like phonological or sound-based difference. But there's another type of dyslexia that is about comprehension or expressive language, where, as I sort of said before, if you have trouble understanding spoken language, that very closely links in our brains. It's sort of back here on the left-hand side, usually, in understanding written language, because those are very similar skills. And then there's the third sort of added layer of, depending on when someone is diagnosed with having dyslexia, if they're not, a lot of the ways that children learn, especially more advanced or sophisticated language or vocabulary or concepts, are through reading. So if a child has dyslexia and they're not getting the right services, or they're not being, or while they're learning how to read, like the sounding out reading stuff, it's important that they are still exposed to like audiobooks or having kids, other people read to them, because sometimes what happens if a child has trouble decoding or reading the actual words, then they're getting a less again, language-rich environment, and then they might eventually have sort of more language differences because they're not reading as much, and reading is a way in which we learn language. So even if a child doesn't have a language difference going in, if they're not receiving services for dyslexia, they might sort of develop a language difference. So there's a cause and an effect component to that.
Yeah, that's super helpful. My next question, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, and I want to ask you about English language learners. And we get a lot of.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
That I was one when I was a kid. So
That's a great question for you then. So we get questions from teachers and from our community about English language learners, and how can you kind of tease apart whether they're still just learning the new language, or if they are having some sort of more serious issue that maybe they need more support for from a speech-language pathologist or a special education teacher?
Yeah, okay, I love this question. The shortest answer is that if there is a difference in the first language or first handful of languages, basically if a child has a language disorder, they would have it in all of their languages. So again, for me, my first language is Hungarian. If I had a difficulty in that and in English, then people could say, okay, that's a language disorder. Whereas as I was learning English, I obviously made mistakes as I was doing it, but I didn't have a difference or a disorder in Hungarian, so that would be sort of part of language learning. So that's like the biggest, most important thing. The other thing that can help is knowing about the first language or languages. Like there are certain languages that don't have articles or don't have pronouns, or certain sounds are different. So if, again, to use like Hungarian example, or like Spanish, for example, in some dialects of Spanish, B and V are pretty similar. So if then a kid in English is mixing up their B's and V's, then that might indicate that it's not really a disorder, because it makes sense. You can understand where the difference comes from. It's based on their sort of first language. And I think the other important thing to note is, even if your child has a developmental disability, whether it's Down syndrome or autism or a language difference, there is currently no research that says that having multiple languages is a disadvantage, or in fact, there are advantages. So I think there are still schools where sometimes people are recommended that they stop using their home language, and there's absolutely no research to say that you should stop using whatever language you're using at home. It can actually disadvantage your child because, as we talked about, natural and authentic language environments, whatever language or languages you speak at home should be maintained, even if a child is going to an English language school. And again, there's now studies on Down syndrome and autism and language disorders and dyslexia as well that show that. So, and I say that because, again, I didn't even have a language disorder, and my parents were still told to not speak Hungarian to me at home. So I think that there is like a confusion around the possibility of whether or not children can be multilingual, and yes, they can.
Yes, I'm really glad that you included that. That's very helpful. I want to ask, again, switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about social skills, and we get a lot of questions from parents about helping their kids in these areas. And a lot of kids with learning and thinking differences struggle with building relationships with their peers for various reasons. And I would imagine kids who have a language disorder or are struggling with communication, that those skills might hinder building those relationships. Do you have suggestions for parents and for kids of what to do?
Yeah, I think a little bit there depends on the diagnosis a little bit. So you're right, there's lots of different things that can lead to social differences. Currently, I actually do a lot of work within the autism population, which there sort of the interventions are a little bit different, but I do want to talk about things like ADHD or developmental language differences can also lead to communication differences, even though they're not like by definition social communication differences. I think that the idea of sort of teaching social skills explicitly is sometimes tricky because, again, I think a lot of the research is showing more and more about authentic interventions for lots of types of kids. And so, again, earlier I talked about things like interests. So basically when kids are involved in their interests, whether, again, it's for reading and writing about something or socializing, almost everyone, regardless of your neurology or age, tends to be social around their interests, right? I spend time with people who have similar interests to me, and then we get to talk about those things. So I think finding areas of strength, which again, by definition, things that kids are really into are their areas of strength, helps create things to talk about and helps create competence so students can feel powerful in, even if they do have an articulation difference or a language difference, they might still know the names of 40 different dinosaurs, and then that can be a source of being social with other kids. So I think using interest, because again, it's mainly about finding strength areas, because even though we are talking about diagnostic differences and potentially disorders or disabilities, all children still have strengths somewhere, and that is where you can get into things around socialization and social communication, because again, that's how everyone communicates, is around things like skills and differences. And I think also recognizing that almost all social rules are arbitrary, and that even typically developing students don't, like 5-year-olds don't go up to someone and say, "Hi, may I play with you?" They run and hit them in the back and say, "Tag, you're it," and run away, right? So I think a lot of the things that I see in typical social skill stuff is like, you have to ask a question and then you have to answer, and it's really much more rote than I see real communication being. So I think the more authentic and naturalistic you can be, the better. And I would avoid sort of some even like traditional social skill stuff, because it doesn't really matter if sometimes people talk for longer than the other people that they're talking to, and that's perfectly fine. So I would say interests and being really authentic and naturalistic about it are my top two for how families and teachers can support that.
That's great. Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this chat, but Jules, I do want to give you a moment if you have any last words of advice or suggestions or encouragement for parents out there and families that are watching. I want to leave the last minute to you.
Sure, thank you. I do feel like the last question actually sort of summarized most of my thinking around how families can support, which again is really supporting kids' interests, because that makes them feel confident, and again is a great way to be social, or like, again, that really supports writing, because writers write about things that they know, so whatever kids know about. And the other thing, that all of these potentially diagnoses or what have you come with associated strengths. So there's like increasing research around how much, like there's a whole book called The Dyslexic Advantage. There are so many strengths that come with learning differences, and I think that the world is becoming a sort of more inclusive place that recognizes that even if your child has some of these challenges, it comes with inherent strengths. And so, we want to support students so they don't feel frustrated. But we also want to celebrate that people thinking differently makes the world a better place.
Absolutely. What a great place to end. Jules, thanks so much for being with us today. And thank you to all of our viewers out there for joining us. If you liked this chat and you want to see upcoming expert video chats, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also check out our calendar of upcoming events at u.org/calendar. And all of our chats are archived. If you missed any part of this chat, if you want to go back and rewatch parts of it, you can find that on our YouTube channel, or you can also find that on our site you can go to our calendar, u.org/calendar, and you'll see all of the archived chats there. Our next chat is coming up next Tuesday, and it is on managing ADHD at home. So go to our calendar and you can RSVP for that chat if that's a topic of interest to you. And if you had a question that didn't get answered today, I would recommend checking out our community. We have lots of families that come on there and educators that support each other, answer each other's questions, give advice, and sometimes our experts like Jules hop on there as well and answer questions. You can find that at u.org/community. Thanks everyone for joining us today.
Don't